Right. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to the NZILA Tuapita Ora Streetscapes Webinar. I'm Angela Hunter, the Chief Operating Officer for NZILA. Today we're delighted to welcome our final speaker for the series for this year, Andrew Grant, who's the founder and director of Grant Associates, as well as our facilitator and host Stu Dunn from Studio Pacific Architecture in Wellington. I'll hand over to Stu in a moment, but first we would just like to give a huge thanks to our webinar sponsor Streetscape, who are instrumental in making this series happen. Again, this session is worth 1 CPD point, so please log that in, and just another reminder that to log all your points by the 31st of December. In a moment, I'll share with you a short video from Streetscapes highlighting their products and services, so please go over and check out their website or contact Paul and the team to chat over your ideas for your next sort of street furniture project. Thanks again for joining us. Stu will join just after the video. Thanks.
Streetscape is New Zealand's leading manufacturer of quality street furniture, lighting poles, shelters, and sculptures that breathe life into our open space environments. Collaborating with landscape architects and designers to share our manufacturing expertise and experience, we create solutions to meet your design brief, your budget, and your project delivery deadline. At Streetscape, we have a great range of off-the-shelf furniture. Together, we can modify and customize our existing ranges to suit, or we can provide the design support to manufacture fully bespoke furniture for your project. With all furniture proudly manufactured in New Zealand from locally and ethically sourced materials, and with over 100 years of combined experience, you can be sure of the craftsmanship. Quality products made to withstand our unique environmental conditions while meeting all local health and safety standards. Local doesn't just mean local knowledge and local jobs. It also means reduced lead times and a local team who manage every step of the way with you to see the project from your concept through to final delivery. Aotearoa, New Zealand, these are our places, our communities, our environments, and we want you to enjoy them the way you imagine them. That's why we go that extra mile every time. Streetscape, turning your imagination into reality. Streetscape, in conjunction with the NZILA, are proud to sponsor the Streetscape Speaker Series.
All right, that's the end of the video, is it? Can everyone hear me and see me? Hopefully they can. Big thanks to you all for joining us, and thanks again to Streetscape for making it happen. It's my great pleasure this morning to welcome Andrew Grant to talk to us, and a big thanks for being up in the evening over there in the UK to be with us this morning. Andrew is a landscape architect whose work explores the connection between people and nature. He started his company Grant Associates in 1997 and has grown into an international design studio with offices in Bath and Singapore. He uses creative ecological design thinking to find solutions to the major challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and improving human quality of life, health, and well-being. In 2012, he was awarded the Royal RSA Royal Designer for Industry in recognition of his pioneering global work in landscape architecture, such as the multi-award-winning Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. There's a long list of other awards, which I won't read them all through, but I'm just noting as well that in 2023, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters by Bath Spa University in recognition of his outstanding work as a landscape architect and his passion and approach to nature, creativity, and imagination. So without further ado, welcome you, Andrew, and look forward to hearing about your journey over those years and where you're headed next.
Stuart, thank you very much. Thank you. So can you hear me, everybody? We're all good?
Yep, all good, Andrew. Loud and clear.
This is where I'm sort of struggling around trying to think of what am I sharing here? What's going on?
Perhaps just while you're setting up too, just a reminder to everybody that there will be a Q&A at the end, and there's a screen at the bottom of your, a tab at the bottom of your screen where you can enter questions, and we'll have an opportunity for those at the end of the talk as well.
So am I sharing full screen? I'm not sure.
No, not quite yet.
No, okay, let me try again. Stop sharing. Share. Choose when you want to share. This one. Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody. I'm sort of struggling, just trying to sort of work through my PowerPoint sharing here. Sorry, I haven't had this before.
There we go.
Still not sharing anything?
No, that's it. That's it. Full screen.
That's it. Okay, good.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank goodness. My goodness. Good morning, everybody. I'm really, really pleased to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about my work. I feel like it's going to be a bit self-indulgent because I'm basically just talking a little bit about my career and the journey that I've been through as a landscape architect. And I hope you don't find it too boring, but it's sort of been quite interesting reflecting on how I became a landscape architect and what are the things that I think have sort of triggered me along the way and these little steps that you go through. But recently I've been sort of thinking very much about, okay, well, what are we all about? What should we be focusing on? And I like this title, Design Like We Are Part of Nature, because so many of the professionals we work with, and sometimes within our own profession, we forget that actually we need to start thinking about we are part of the sort of natural world. And I know that in New Zealand, that's absolutely fundamentally part of everybody's sort of thinking about how you deal with it. But certainly in lots of the places that we work in, designing like we are part of nature is like a sort of an alien concept. And I started to think about where did I begin to think about this, and I started looking back through my student sort of sketches and school sketches, and these are back in the 1970s when I'd started to become aware of the challenges of development and human development and the impact on the natural world. I don't know where that came from, but it was, you know, these are sort of little doodles that I was doing at that time when I was doing my A-level artwork at school in East Yorkshire. I grew up on a farm, so I just looking at these images, I'm thinking, where did these come from? And it was clearly something right at the beginning, this sort of like dystopian disconnect between humans and the natural world clearly had taken root all those years ago. And I can't sort of reflect back on my sort of early career without thinking about the whole environment that I grew up in. Yes, I grew up on a farm. It was idyllic. It was beautiful. It was a countryside. It was nature. It was immersed in the seasons, all those sort of things. And then parallel to that, it was like this other world of music, and punk was just absolutely mind-blowingly important to me at that time, and started to sort of take me out of that little country idyll into the reality of what is going on in the world and what is going on in cities, because living up in a little village in East Yorkshire with 700 people was very different to being in the city of London or Sheffield or wherever it was that had sort of hundreds of thousands of people. And I went to, I decided to study landscape architecture after visiting Edinburgh and going to the Edinburgh College of Art, and just been bowled over by the beauty of the space and the place and the urbanism of that place. And not knowing anything about landscape architecture, I started to really enjoy that. And we were very, very lucky to have somebody who was running the course at Edinburgh College of Art in the late 70s, early 80s, called David Skinner, who was a student of Ian McHarg, Design with Nature. And all of the principles that Ian McHarg talked about, David sort of applied to this course. So right from the beginning, the idea of applying ecological thinking to the design, the planning, the process of landscape architecture was embedded within me. Now, the images I've got up here are basically probably the first 10 years of my career, just a sort of snapshot of the things I did after coming out of the sort of the university world. So very shortly after coming out of university, I went to Qatar. And this is in the early 80s. And I worked on a number of projects with the Emir and his family, which is quite extraordinary because it was a completely alien culture, but it introduced me to the most amazing quality of materials and craftsmanship, and absolutely the idea of international idea of design, you know, bringing in people from all over the world to do something special. And after I was there for 3 years, and after 3 years, I'd soaked all of that up, and it was just an amazing opportunity. But I came back to the UK, and I started work for a company called Nicholas Pearson Associates, who totally different world. It was like they were doing landscape impact assessments, environmental assessments of major infrastructure projects such as oil fields and nuclear power stations and highways, motorway widening, which I jumped into. I'm just trying to sort of explore what does that mean in terms of creativity and the likes. The Witch Farm oil field, for instance, was down in the south of the UK in Poole Harbour, which is one of the most special environments in the UK in terms of its scenery and its ecological integrity. But BP had found oil underneath Poole Harbour, and so they wanted to figure out how to get oil out of that place. And so I was just one of a small team, and we were looking at how do we hide all the infrastructure? How do we look at using color and disguise and camouflage to make all of this disappear? And following that, just working with Winfrith Atomic Energy Technology Station, which was how do we make these sort of nuclear power station technology research stations disappear in this sort of heathland landscape, and exploring color. And at the same time then exploring how do we do landscape assessments of one of the most amazing places in the UK, Dartmoor National Park, and how do we develop new designs for this is back in the 80s, where most of the landscape architecture world was actually, how do you design a car park for the major supermarkets that were popping up all over the country. So this was, I worked on the one in Tesco in Dorchester in the UK, which was influenced by Prince Charles and the Duchy of Cornwall and all of that sort of agenda of neoclassical world. So complete mashup of experience and all the rest of it in those early years. And then I got a little bit bored with all of that. I'm thinking, what does all this mean? And I wrote to Geoffrey Jellicoe. Now, I don't know if everybody is aware of who Geoffrey Jellicoe is, or was. But when I was growing up, he was like one of the preeminent landscape architects that you'd know about. He wrote the Landscape of Man, a sort of really beautiful story of the history of humans and how they have designed landscapes through history. And I went to see, he invited me to sort of go and see him at his home in Highgate, which is this extraordinary modernist building, engineered by Ove Arup himself. And, so Geoffrey was 94 at the time. And I was basically just this timid little landscape architect, and I went across to see him in this place. And he wrote me this letter after I'd been to see him and showed him my work, which completely changed my life in a way, I think, because it basically, I think your drawings are stunning, and I hope at least some journals will publish them. So it gave me faith that there was something that I was doing and thinking about and drawing which was of interest. A whole load of other things that Geoffrey Jellicoe sort of inspired me about, but probably one of the most interesting ones was in his house, he had this wall of absolutely original paintings by lots of the 20th century classic artists, whether it's Klee, Picasso, Ben Nicholson, all these people, and they were literally sitting on a wall next to where he was drawing. And on the other side of that, looking out the windows, little windowsill, was a whole load of like ceramic cats and dogs. And it was this bizarre sort of conflict between these worlds, these sort of like absolutely driven, beautiful, sort of artworks, and this sort of like bizarre world of kitsch, cats and dogs, which I took to heart. And most of my work since then has basically tried to be a part of that sort of story. Anyway, so following that experience with Geoffrey, I thought I need to do something different. I can't just work doing all this sort of weird, I don't know what I'm doing, mishmash of sort of projects. So I thought I need to be a bit more disciplined. And I started to think about how do we start to rethink what landscape architecture is about in a bit more focused way. And one of the first projects I did was with a guy called Andrew Wright, who's an architect working with Richard Rogers Partnership at the time. And he had a commission to think about a Buddhist community on Holy Island, off the Isle of Arran on Scotland. Now this is, you can tell from this image, I mean, it's a bit New Zealand-like, I guess, in many respects, but in terms of the UK, it is like, oh my goodness, this is an amazing place. And the idea was to place a Buddhist community on this hillside, absolutely tuned into the sort of the principles of Buddhism, and it would be a retreat. It's not just a place to go for a holiday and stuff. It would be a retreat where you would stay there for up to 20 odd years. And the longer you stayed, the higher up the hillside you would live. And it sort of became a sort of really interesting reference point in terms of this idea of living and community, and how do we create a landscape that sustains that. Now, you're not going to see all of the sort of details and the facts and figures on these, but for me, what was interesting was actually try to apply some data, I guess, to what are the landscape elements that we need to think about if we want to create a self-sufficient community living on this very exposed hillside on at the side of a mountain on an island off Scotland. And so worked with agronomists and people who specialise in water. And it was all about how do we use the sort of topography, how do we create different sort of opportunities depending on the levels of the slopes and the exposure of the slopes to create an environment to think about growing food. How much food do we need? How many square meters of soft fruit do we need? How many square meters of herbs do we need? How much water do we need to capture to sustain this community? And I found it really, really interesting as a sort of a completely different sort of approach to thinking about landscape, which I then went on to apply to, sorry, apologies for the quality of these, but they basically pulled off what was the Richard Rogers Partnership website is now the RSHP website, where I worked with them to think about this project in Mallorca, where we were trying to think about how to sustain a new township. And a new township, which is basically meant to be creating this idyllic world to come and live, whilst you could tap into modern technology, internet and everything else and work anywhere in the world. And once again, it was trying to find this balance between the food, the leisure, the spatial experience of living there, the proximity of neighborhoods and all those sort of things. So, you know, really, really interesting early sort of thinking of me, you know, how do I start to create a world that I quite like living in, and, you know, this is what I'm interested in. And after I started Grant Associates, which was 96, 97, you know, I forget when, it was one of those areas, but the first big project we won was the Earth Centre project in Conisbrough, which was a millennium project for the UK government. The National Lottery were putting in some money to this, and the whole philosophy was this is a project about sustainable development, and it was a wonderful concept. You know, this is started probably in around 94 as an idea, but with a client team, Jonathan Smales and his team. But how do we create a focus for sustainable development in the UK at that time? And there's so many elements that came from this project which were sort of ahead of their time. Sadly, it did not work as a visitor attraction, because basically what happened was there were so many of these projects happening around the UK at that time that the National Lottery actually decided to place most of the money in the O2 and the Millennium Dome in London and into the Eden project. So it raided all the projects, all the money that was going to go to these more regional projects, and put them into those sort of more centralized, big icon projects, which meant that this didn't have the sort of the complete sort of potential that it could have had if it had included the amazing buildings. But for me and my team, you know, it was like a unique opportunity. It was like a test bed to think about what is a sustainable landscape, thinking about water systems, thinking about the use of materials, thinking about how do we create new forms of buildings and structures. And I guess this sort of slide starts to illustrate that with one of my sort of early sketches of how do we think about water on this site. And on the right-hand side, you start to see there sort of the idea of using recycled glass, recycled stone, so quite prehistoric plants. How do we create interesting structures from green timber? So it was for me, and this is way back in 96, early days of the whole, what is currently known as, the sort of the regenerative design, or sort of donut thinking, or cycles of systems and system thinking, all the rest of it, which we've tried to sort of apply to our projects ever since. And it failed as a visitor attraction, but it's there as a landscape. This was originally a derelict coalfield, so everything you see on here which is green would have been black, just black dust. And we helped to restore this into a really biodiverse country park. And the bit in the middle there that you see is now used as a sort of a children's school, sort of outdoor retreat. So during the summer particularly, that you get 600 school children from all over Yorkshire just using this site as a place to be outside and learning and be part of a team, or just exploring new sort of things. As I jump through this presentation, and I'm going to sort of jump through really fast, this is just a snapshot of things that I've enjoyed doing. It's not trying to sort of be a complete profile of everything I've ever done or anything, but after just getting a bit of profile with the Earth Centre and the idea of environmental design, we started to get sort of invitations to do some interesting things. And one of them was, would you like to do the garden for the British Pavilion at the Japan Expo in 2005 in Nagoya? And yes, please, that would be amazing. And we were very keen that it wasn't just, here's another British garden which is about perennial gardening or roses or whatever. We were quite keen to make sure that it was about an environmental narrative, total sort of idea of ecology and the rest of it. And we landed on this idea that we'd like to create a woodland, because the expo was meant to be there for 6 months. And we liked the idea that this would be a woodland that would start off, a deciduous woodland that would start off with bare twigs and basically an understory, and you get the spring, and then you get the summer, and you get the different sort of seasons. And it was really interesting that actually in Japan, we had the idea of a lime tree, as a common lime tree as the main tree. And in Japan, they have very similar Japanese equivalent. So we had this sort of seasonal sequence of extraordinary, lovely transition of planting. And here you see in the sort of peak summer as it's coming out, the foxgloves and the ferns. And interspersed within this was a number of sort of amazing artworks by UK artists. But it struck us then that actually in this very small space, it's about 25 meters by 18 meters, but it was taking 30,000 people a day just walking through, going, oh, this is really lovely. And it just shows the impact you can do in a very small footprint, just to capture, people's awareness of things that are going on. And as we move on through the sort of story, the different projects have told me different things. This is in Bristol, in the UK, Bristol Harbourside, where we did a master plan project with Ted Cullinan. And one of the main things was basically creating this visual access to the SS Great Britain, which was the first sort of steamship, big sort of metal steamship that would sail across the world. Brunel's invention. You can't see the ship itself because of the building, but you can see the masts there. And we thought it'd be really wonderful to create a new sort of rich biodiverse engagement with the water and this view. And you can sort of see this ramp falling down, and either side, a really quite rich meadow type planting, and then lots of little places for people just to sit and enjoy the view as they came down the ramp. And there's behind this, although it's just a nice place to sit, there's a whole story about how we collecting the water from the rooftop to the residential buildings behind, and they're filtering down into this rainwater sort of rain garden channel that flows beneath the seats. And so you have this wonderful sort of seasonal experience. And ultimately that water gets down towards the floating harbour, and the bit that you see in the middle of that is basically floating reed beds, which are sort of doing some final water polishing before the water gets into the harbour. So this was, once again, in sort of early 2000s, just thinking through those environmental sort of ideas, the process of water flow, biology, ecology, those sort of things. And then in 2005, we were part of a team that won the RIBA Sterling Prize for this project in Cambridge called Accordia, which is a housing project. And the whole concept that we came up with is the idea of living in a garden. Quite high density, but basically the idea of, here's a neighborhood, but within this neighborhood we have multiple places to go and experience, whether it's the top of the plan here, which is much more ecological. You can see some very formal spaces in the middle there, and then you can see these sort of orangey green spaces, which we call street gardens, which are basically shared spaces for the residents, where they can play, they can grow vegetables, they can do all sorts of things. So it won the Sterling Prize in 2008, which was, it's the highest accolade for an architectural project in the UK. And it still remains one of the most significant housing projects, I think, over the last 30, 40 years as a sort of reference project that people come to. And for us, it was a joy to be part of the key master plan process. And as you build that reputation of this is what you've done, you start to understand, you build confidence, I guess. And Gardens by the Bay in Singapore was another leap, and probably lots of you have been there, maybe some of you have been there, I don't know, but this goes back to 2005, almost 20 years ago. I got a call in the office saying there's somebody from the National Parks Board in Singapore would like to meet you in London. Completely out of the blue. We are a tiny little office in Bath in the UK. And so I went to meet them in London, and we submitted an expression of interest on the back of that to try for this competition to develop a 54-hectare park in Singapore. Completely new to us. We had never idea of how to do that before. But clearly it's been a massive sort of impact in terms of our profile and the opportunities it has opened. And I guess what it did as an international project, it made us think about, well, okay, what are we thinking about this? And you sort of go off in all sorts of directions trying to find, where are we going to find this core idea for this project? Excuse me. And I found this quote from Edgar Allan Poe. A garden is a landscape whose combined vastness and definitiveness, and whose united beauty, magnificence and strangeness shall convey an idea of care or culture or superintendence. And at the time I didn't know what it meant, or I guess nobody knows what it meant really. But it struck me there's some amazing words in there that sort of just inspire. And that was what we carried into the project. And a couple of early sketches from myself, which was starting to talk about, let's root this around the idea of the orchid being the sort of the national flower of Singapore, and the most cosmopolitan plant species on the planet. And it has these unique qualities. At one hand, on the left-hand side of the image there, the idea of this, effectively the infrastructure, the roots and the leaves that basically sustain the plant. And on the right side, the idea of the flowers being the beautiful gardens, and the stems with their very particular sort of geometry becoming the path network. It was a very simple idea, and to be honest, I mean, it's buried. You would never imagine that in a million years if you go there. But it sort of started as the story about how we could start to imagine this project. And alongside that, alongside the aesthetic and the sensory and the spatial experience, was the idea that let's look at this, let's think about this as an ecosystem and how we can reimagine this place as something that starts to integrate things that are usually dealt with separately, whether it's energy or water or biodiversity or waste. And, you know, this is a very simplistic diagram that we did at the competition stage, but ultimately it inspired the engineers to come up with solutions to create a zero carbon in operation glasshouse in the tropics. And that idea of teamwork and collaboration is fundamental to all of the great projects. This is myself. On the left-hand side is Dr. Tan, who is our main client, who's just an amazing character and who's still involved with Gardens by the Bay. Behind him is Paul Baker from Wilkins-Nair Architects. Patrick Bellew from Atelier 10, amazing environmental engineer. And then myself, and then Neil Thomas, just an astonishing structural engineer. We were all the same age. We didn't know at the time, but we were all the same age when we just suddenly realized, oh my God, we're all this same age on this project at the same time. So that, you know, the idea of finding people that you can grow your network and relationship with and mature as a professional, I think is really, really important. I could spend hours talking about the Gardens by the Bay in terms of some of the ideas behind it and some of the ideas that never met the sort of the full potential. But I always love these diagrams because they talk about the idea of stories and how we can use landscape to tell stories. And very simplistically, the red bits in the right-hand diagram are where we want to tell the stories of the relationship of plant species and the culture, the principal cultures of Singapore. And the green ones, the light green ones and the dark green ones, is really where we wanted just to sort of highlight the beauty and the qualities of Southeast Asian rainforests, and you know the role of plants in terms of sustaining the planet, and the vulnerability of that too. And then the orange bit in the middle is really the integration of those and how we can start to think about cultural and natural and technological interplay. And if you interrogate the gardens today, you could still find those if you really delve into the narratives. But principally, Gardens by the Bay is about, let's blow everybody's minds about the most amazing plants on the planet, how amazing they are, how spatially, visually, ecologically spectacular plants are, and how they lift our spirits. And there's so many sort of versions of that, depending on how many photos you want to take of Gardens by the Bay that come to life. I'm going to flick through some images that just showcase some of the challenges, the super trees, which are basically this cluster of artificial tree forms. 50 meters high is the maximum, 25 meters the lowest, but how did we plant those? And it became this sort of this amalgamation of air plants, or plants that would just grow up the structure, or plants that would be planted into really interesting, simple green wall systems, I guess. But each one, the idea of each tree being planted in a different way. And planting is one thing in Singapore, just the experience of day and night is another, just the whole climate and the comforts and all the rest of it. So how do we think about how do we use lighting and create different ambience according to different parts of the day? And these are some early sketches by Karu Mendy and Lighting Planners Associates from Tokyo. When we talked about the super trees, they started to talk about, well, we wanted to give them all personalities that they could start to talk to each other with light. And that is ultimately transposed into, I think, one of the most spectacular aspects of Gardens by the Bay, which is the nighttime experience, where you can go there every night and have a free sound and light show. And every night there are 3,000 or 4,000 people just come and gather in this sort of central space, often just lying on the floor, just looking up and listening to the music and experiencing the light effects. And, you know, it just makes you realize that, you know, using light and sound in landscape is such an underused phenomenon. The cloud forest is another one of those places which is just one of those mind-blowing, you know, when you're drawing it, you think, oh, this is all going to be really quite interesting. But when you sort of see it in real life and when full misting and lighting and planting experience, it is just amazing. But this is essentially, you know, 50-meter high building clad in plants. And one of the challenges we had was, how do we create the opportunities, the fabric to sustain a variety of plant types on this, effectively just, it's a concrete skin with an organic render. There was interestingly developing a render on the surface of the concrete skin, which basically has organic material within it, so it holds moisture. And then on top of that, you started to build pockets and baskets and little voids and planting containers and all the rest of it to create these niches of diversity, which start to provide the space for the most amazing diversity of plants, which, you know, you just get there and you just think, my goodness, it's amazing. And, you know, wherever you go in Gardens by the Bay, you're struck by, you know, just the amazing impact of plants and the beauty of plants here on the Lost World at the top of the mountain, the pitcher plants, or the waterfall, or the amazing interplay between artworks and the planting. The other biome at Gardens by the Bay is the flower dome, and every year they sequence the sort of central space with thematic ideas. And it's really about how do we make sure that we get lots of return visitors. And this last year, they basically reproduced Monet's Giverny Gardens. This is Monet's villa in Giverny in France. And they created this whole curated garden, amazing colors, and a digital internal exhibition about how Monet used color and plants to create his artworks and his garden. Really quite fascinating. And of course, you know, Gardens by the Bay has become a really unique biodiverse sort of focus, not least for the otters, smooth-coated otters, which have now become a tourist attraction in their own right, but also for the dragonflies, for the kingfishers and the birds that sort of inhabit at this place. So it's just become one of those fantastic examples of create this diversity of habitats, and people just will come and enjoy that, you know, either as it's the most amazing place or the most popular place to get your pre-wedding photos taken, or it's the most popular place for photographers to take photographs of birds or dragonflies. It's, you know, it's just one of those places. And because of that, it's picked up lots of accolades, and not least the idea that it's become this sort of place which is an icon I guess, for Singapore, and picked up as part of the branding of the city, which for us has been really useful because it's sort of led to some really interesting other projects in the region and different parts of the world. So Gardens by the Bay, as you can imagine, has been this extraordinary launch pad for us. At one level, working in Malaysia, in this Endau Rompin National Park, where we were commissioned to look at a strategic planning study to figure out how to, at one level, open up this environment for tourism, at the same time making sure that you did not impact on this amazing habitats. They had 25 wild tigers living in this 80,000 hectares of tropical rainforest, plus all the other amazing species you can imagine. So quite fragile. But we came up with this plan for, really starting to think about how do you start to create a tourist offer, which is not just about going into the rainforest, but it's about the rainforest and the coastline and the islands, and actually sort of starting to be quite definitive about where people can go and where the wildlife can be. And in a similar way in Singapore, having the opportunity to lead, a master planning team for one of the most significant projects in Singapore, which is, the future development of Sentosa, which is the main island for leisure in Singapore. And then the island you get right in the middle there, the sort of with the big blue circle and the sort of slightly angular edges, that is currently the heart of the port of Singapore, the sort of second or third most busy port in the world, which has been moved. So what are they going to do with that space? And so we've been looking with a number of architects and consultants as to how to integrate that as part of the Sentosa offer, so it becomes like a world-class leisure destination that will be completely unique and completely Singaporean in its nature. I'm probably running out of time a little bit here, but I'm just going to race through a few other projects which for me have been quite significant because they touch on different parts of the world. Australia, the closest project we've done, I guess, to New Zealand, but Barangaroo South in Sydney with Lend-Lease creating this public space at Waterman's Cove next to the new casino and the Lend-Lease Barangaroo South projects. And quite different, it's a much more urban project, but the idea was, how do we create a place that really captures the spirit of Sydney and optimizes the experience of the harbour? And one of the things that struck us right from the beginning was actually, this is a wonderful place just to sort of stop and take the sunset. At the end of the day, you can come out of your offices, out of your homes, and just sit on this sandstone edge, sandstone and timber edge, looking over the water and see the sunset, and just all of enjoy the sort of loveliness of the ambience of that experience. And basically that's effectively how it's manifested itself. It's just such a really lovely, simple space to do that. As I said, it's a slightly eclectic bunch of projects that I'm sort of talking through. This is one going back to 2022, which was meant to be a celebration of the Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. And we were, after a competition, we were invited to come up with a proposal to transform the Tower of London, the moat at the Tower of London, from what you can see in the top right image there, which is effectively just a piece of mown turf, which had been like that since the 1849, I think as Duke of Wellington decided that he was going to fill in the moat and just let it be grass because it was so stinky and smelly. But But with the historic roller palaces, we decided, let's try and just make this a summer of flowers. And that was the whole agenda, with creating a series of walks and experiences as you walk through this space that just celebrated colour and bees and all the sort of things that you hoped will come if you sort of fill this sort of place with flowers. And you know, thousands of people came along, and it was a great success. And at night time, we could just, with simple lighting, just transform that experience into something quite extraordinary. The important thing here is that this was meant to be just a little one-off sort of summer experience, but the client has now taken this on to say, okay, well, how are we going to completely transform this moat back into a biodiverse, amazing landscape, reintroduce water in certain areas, but actually make it sure that it acts as a real extraordinarily rich habitat at the heart of London that becomes a sort of a real, you know, sanctuary for wildlife, but also an amazing place for people to experience this. So that's a project that'll be coming forward in the next couple of years. Somebody needs to tell me if I need to stop, because I've got slides I can keep talking for for a long time, but I need to tell you about this one, I think, which is a recent one which has opened earlier this year. It's in Bangalore in India. It's an airport terminal, and we worked with SOM architects with the idea of creating something very different to the usual international architect sort of thing, which is typically defined by a very funky roof and sort of all sorts of weird shapes inside. And this one was basically saying, this is going to be a garden. And the client was very clear on that. This was a terminal in a garden was the brief. And so we worked with SOM to make sure that wherever you went through this experience, landscape would be the principal focus. The architecture was this very subtle, beautiful backdrop to that. And you know, here's one of my early sketches, just talking about that journey, the idea of every part of the journey, from your check-in to your security, to your sitting in the lounge, to getting to your gate, to getting on the plane, is an experience that engages with landscape and nature. And that was processed, and we worked through lots and lots of sort of iterations of this with the architects at different ways and different levels of sophistication. And but ultimately, you know, the wayfinding devices, the sort of the narratives, the viewpoints are all about how do we use landscape to guide people through this place, and in a secure way, in a safe way, and in a distinctive way. And one of the big things in the check-in hall are these extraordinary hanging planted bell structures, which were meant to basically just define that's the way towards your security and domestic or international sort of gates, and just using landscape to guide that. So these are just different iterations of those sort of images. And I think it's really telling, you know, just looking at the sort of sky, the ceiling there, that we were working all the time with the engineers and the architects to understand how do we get the light to sustain this planting in the right sort of levels. And ultimately, you know, quite a sophisticated way of thinking about the construction of all of this. But at the end of the day, it is, you know, it's quite a spectacular place to be, so different to just your standard check-in hall. And this is your cue towards the security. The bells just become this amazing sort of icon that hang over you. And as you walk through, the landscape becomes this sort of continual element, sometimes just picking up some local references like the amazing colors of the local soil, outside, we have what's called the forest belt, which is this sort of 50-60 meter wide corridor that separates the main central terminal building from the gates, and everybody has to pass through this. And the walkways through this are not sort of glass enclosed; they basically open on the side, so you feel the nature as you're walking through the space. You can hear the birds, you can see the water, you can just have a sense of this experience, and always looking back into the extraordinary rich internal spaces. So it's been, you know, a real joy to be part of this particular project, and you know, it's still not quite finished. The forest belt will have pathways through it, so even though if you've got a few hours to spare, you could just go for a walk through this garden and go into these pavilions which have restaurants or just viewpoints within them. I got so many things I could talk about. As I say, I've sort of tried to edit these down quite a lot, but this is an exciting one as well in Africa. This is Green City Kigali in Rwanda, which basically we've just heard today that the idea that we've got the instruction to start to developing the first sort of piece of this master plan into a detailed design proposal. But it's 10,000 homes. You know, it's a really important sort of piece of Rwanda evolution, Kigali, trying to sort of figure out how to create a contemporary, modern living environment that embodies all of the things that are traditional and culturally significant and ecologically significant for this part of Africa. And it's going to be great to see how that evolves over the next few years. As is this project, which is in Monaco, very different. But like so many cities in the world, it sort of lost its sense of, well, what is the landscape of Monaco? And this view basically tells it all. All of the dense planning you can see along the coastline in the foreground is Monaco. It's literally 2 square kilometers. It's the second densest urban environment in the world. And beyond that, the greeny bits and the sort of the mountains is France. This amazing landscape backdrop. And what we've been asked to do is to come up with a landscape and biodiversity strategy which tries to stitch back some landscape and habitat fabric which reconnects the sea, the coastline, back up to that sort of mountain ridge. And by doing so, doing it in an authentic way, so you're actually really starting to create proper environments for the biodiversity, the authentic biodiversity of Monaco to come into play. Sorry, is it time for me to stop?
Sorry, Andrew. I hate to cut you off. It's all so fascinating. Maybe just round this one out. And there are a couple of questions in there. I'm conscious we're kind of out of time, but
I'll just. I mean, I'm basically. So Monaco is, you know, it's an amazing project. It's a live project, and we are. So this is the green infrastructure sketch that I did. Started to show how we do that, and how we create different environments. But ultimately, we're now working on sort of a number of projects which will start to deliver that in a really interesting way. So with that, I will, how do I stop sharing? Have I stop sharing? There you go. Sorry, I had too much to talk about. A lifetime of projects that sort of just get in the way.
Yeah, no, don't apologise. It's fantastic. I mean, I could listen to you all morning, and I'm sure most of the other people online could as well. It's incredible catalogue of projects and experiences, and I think just that blend of creativity and imagination and you know, ecology and engineering and all of those things, and that you talked about the sort of the collaboration being such a key part of the work, and that really comes through. So no, really inspiring selection. There are a couple of questions, and maybe we'll probably got time to get them in quickly. And the first one here was one actually that I was going to ask too, which was around the ecological context within those designs. And the way that you integrate planting and plants, and the local kind of ecological context. And I guess the question here is, working across different countries with completely different contexts and ecosystems, how do you go about gaining the thorough understanding of the local plants and incorporating them so effectively into the work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And just going back to my early career, when I sort of I was living in Qatar. That was when I learned that actually whatever you've learned in the UK and you've done your horticultural course and everything else, you know nothing. And so working in Qatar made me realize that you need to sort of have that local knowledge and the cultural knowledge. It's not just about the plants, it's basically the whole horticultural industry and where the plants come from and all those sort of things become part of that. And then the last project I showed, actually what we're working on at the moment is a properly researched piece of research into what are the plants that we should be using in Monaco in 2025, in the context of here's the native species, this is what's happening with climate change, habitats are moving, and so we are working with ecologists, we're working with botanists who are so familiar with all that part of the world. So we're getting into that place, I think, where we can't do what we do without actually that real detailed understanding of those elements, which is another level of collaboration. And unfortunately in Monaco, we've got a client who's willing to pay for that research so that we can actually just test it and understand what are the ways forward. But yeah, really, I think that's one of the biggest things that's happening certainly in the UK and in Europe in terms of what plants should we use and where do we use them.
So do you have people within your practice? You have ecologists and plant specialists, or do you work with ecologists and local?
We have a couple of people who are very interested in it, but they're not specialists. And so we do work with ecologists, and for the Monaco project, I mean, basically we had 13 consultants, sub-consultants, specialists working with us alongside us: soil, water, ecology, lighting, mobility. I think that's one of the interesting things at the moment is everything is connected, and how do you make those connections, and how does we as landscape architects help to choreograph or curate or manage that process? I think that's a big role for us going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a segue into another question I was curious about too. You talked a lot in your earlier days about sustainable development and looking at sustainable development as a term, and I guess there's been a lot of conversation, and the conversation shifted, sustainability, biodiversity, regenerative design, and I was just curious perhaps what's how this idea of sustainability has perhaps shifted over your career so far, and what you think where's that going? What does a sustainable development look like in our current context? It's a big question, but
yeah, no, but it's a very important question, because I mean it's where are we heading, isn't it? What do we aim for? I mean, back in the the early 90s, it was like, it's interesting how people latched on to water and materials and things, and there was a sort of collection of very objective things, and in a way today, it's as much about thinking about the circular economy and that sort of thing as much as changing people's mindsets. There's a sort of a cultural narrative as well as a sort of a very practical sort of objective data collecting narrative as well. That I think we have a role to play in that. But it's a shifting picture, and we just need to keep creating examples of projects that you can prove this has had this benefit, this has changed people's thoughts about the world. This is, how do we keep sort of those stepping stones towards the ultimate goal? Because I mean, we're a tiny profession, but we have potentially a lot of influence in terms of how we reshape urban environments.
Absolutely. That's brilliant, Andrew. I'm conscious of the time, and we've run a bit over, but I'm sure we've still got everybody with us. So just want to say a massive thank you for taking the time to share that with us all, and again, just that inspiration, that kind of blend of creativity and imagination is really powerful. So thank you. Just a note to everyone else that the recording of this will be up on the NZILA website coming up soon, and that this was the last of the series of the Streetscape speaker series for this year. So a big thanks again to Streetscape for sponsoring it, and the team are kind of busy working on a program for next year. But Andrew, thank you so much for sharing that with us all, and really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Stuart. Thanks everybody for staying with me. So thanks again.
All right, excellent. We look forward to seeing you over this way soon.
Yeah, soon. We'll be there soon. Yeah.
Okay, great, fantastic.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks.